After a global pandemic, conflict in the Middle East, and countless weather related disasters, it's become increasingly clear that domestic manufacturing supply chains are a business and a geopolitical imperative. It's against that backdrop that Qcells announced its latest project, the first fully vertically integrated solar facility in the country in Cartersville, Georgia. It's a $2.5 billion bet that, together with the company's Dalton plant, is expected to reach roughly 8.4 gigawatts of annual capacity and employ close to 4,000 Georgians by the end of the year. And it's landing at a critical moment. 1 year ago, Congress repealed the Inflation Reduction tax credits that helped spark this manufacturing boom. Few people have had a closer view of that whole arc than my guest today, Scott Moskowitz, Vice President of Market Strategy and Public Affairs at Qcells. Scott has spent nearly a decade at Qcells and has helped Senator Jon Ossoff's team craft what became the solar manufacturing credits in the IRA. In January, he was elected chair of the Solar Energy Industries Association's board. Today, we're talking with Scott about how he got into the solar industry, why building a domestic supply chain matters more than ever, and what the U.S. solar industry is fighting for now that the IRA tax credits are largely gone. Scott, thank you for joining us on the Echo Chamber.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Let's start with you and your background. You've been at Qcells since 2018, which is kind of before solar became the political football that it is today. How did you get into solar, and what pulled you towards the policy side of things?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I'm an environmental engineer by education, and I had left grad school and ended up working never as an engineer. I ended up working at a company called GTM Research, which was part of Green Tech Media, which is now, it's been part of Wood Mackenzie since 2016 or so. But started out working as a consultant and doing market research and strategy work for, pretty much every clean energy company you can think of, where, they were involved in GTM's conferences, they were customers and clients, and, got a really good early look into, how this industry was evolving, what was important to companies. And for me, like it was, I joined Qcells in 2018 and, came here to largely do that type of work, business development, general strategy. But as an analyst, had a really, fundamental perspective at understanding the influences of policy on the market, right? And saying if a policy exists, this is what impact it's going to have on the forecast for how much installations are going to occur. This is what impact it's going to have on pricing. This is geopolitically how it's going to affect trade policy and all these other issues that, became really pressing, in particular in 2020 when the pandemic started. But really even before then started, tracking and understanding the geopolitics of our industry and how a lot of the success on the deployment side is tied to that, to the manufacturing, to the supply chains, and making sure that our industry could evolve in a really healthy and sustainable way. So, yeah, when I came here, we were in the middle of building our first factory in Georgia. It was, at the time, it was the largest investment in solar manufacturing in U.S. history, and it was eventually dwarfed by what we're now doing in Cartersville. But because the company was the largest company doing that, we sort of found ourselves in a position of needing to advocate and support ourselves from a policy basis, and kind of just jumped into doing it and have been doing it ever since.
And you were just elected chair of SEIA's board. You're taking the reins at a tough moment for the industry. What do you most want to get done in that role?
Yeah, I think for me and for a company like Qcells, we think that, I often describe as we're best known as a manufacturer, but, we are a diversified clean energy company that is part of a globally diversified industrial company. So, we are operating in every market segment. We do manufacturing, we do financing, construction, development work, we do storage, we are an investor in other parts of the market. There's really nothing that we don't have our fingertips in to some degree. And so we generally think we're pretty reflective of the industry as a whole. So it's been a really neat opportunity to chair the association differentiation. I think for all of us, we're mostly intent on, recognizing and trying to take advantage of the fact that we have load growth in the United States at a meaningful level for the first time in decades. We have an affordability crisis of which electricity is a key element and aspect of that. And we have a technology in solar and storage that is a solution to that problem. It is the technology that is the fastest to deploy. It is the cheapest to deploy. It is demonstrated to lower costs, and it can be done at any level, residential, commercial, and utility, because unlike, pretty much any other energy technology, it's totally modular. You can install 10 modules on a roof, or you can install 100,000 out, in a utility scale site. So, I think with that in mind, we've had a bruising year and a half, but, that's largely the nature of, partisan politics and how these bills have been passed. But at the end of the day, I view this technology is completely nonpartisan. This is not a political issue. This is a technology issue. And we have the tools available that can make it such that you can address the affordability crisis while meeting load growth, with solar and batteries. And so for us, and for SEIA in general, really just trying to share that message and depoliticize what has become needlessly political, so that we can get the kinds of things that we need as an industry that accelerate that deployment, whether that's permitting reform, whether that's more investment in manufacturing, whether that's in making sure all the states have, minimal barriers to installing and supporting solar and storage at as fast of a pace as you can get. So, it's a complicated time, but I think it's an interesting time because the politics has shifted so much over the last 6 months.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the politics, and how you appeal to folks on both sides of the aisle. And one thing that has a lot of bipartisan appeal is domestic manufacturing. You just started production at your facility in Cartersville, which you call the first fully vertically integrated solar factory in the country.
Mm-hmm.
For folks who might not be familiar with that concept, why does that matter? What's the case for making everything in one place instead of importing things from across the globe?
Yeah, I mean, the solar panel supply chain is, you have polysilicon wafer cells and modules. Historically, the U.S. has had a pretty significant volume of polysilicon production. And over the last 10 years, we've had a fair amount of module assembly capacity. It's really those pieces in between, cell and wafer, that have created really distinct bottlenecks that have challenged, that created challenges during the pandemic. It created challenges after the passing of certain policies. And for us, that is by making those two particular components, the cell and wafer, in-house, it is how you can show customers that you can deliver on time. You can ensure that every aspect of what is in that panel is traced. You know exactly where it came from. You know exactly where it was made. And in our industry, that's the kind of certainty that customers need. So, we've been delighted to see the renaissance in manufacturing that's occurred, not just by Qcells, but by others. And there's still a long way to go. I was on a podcast recently where I sort of framed it in that there's this, you kind of have like 4 stages to a manufacturing renaissance. You had where we were 10 years ago, which was on the brink of extinction in the United States. Really you'll remember the 201 trade case that was filed in 2017 was filed by SolarWorld, who was at the time and remains bankrupt. Right. And that is an industry. So as an industry, we were on the verge of extinction, and we, have clawed back from that pretty significantly to where we are now, which is sort of this second point where, we are scaled at certain parts of the market. We're fully self-sufficient in the United States in terms of getting modules. If you install a solar panel in the United States, there's a really, really good chance that it was made, at least assembled here. The third phase would be having a market that's fully self-sufficient, which is where you have all of not just the modules, but the cells and the wafers and the poly. We're not quite there yet. So there's still significant opportunity to invest. And then aspirationally, the fourth phase is where we have enough capacity that we're not just supplying ourselves, but we're globally competitive in deploying product around the world like we do in other industries. So that's a tough goal to do, but I think it's where there's a lot of opportunity to continue to get new investments.
And it's a lot of jobs too. I think it's about 4,000 jobs in Georgia between Dalton and Cartersville.
Mm-hmm.
And Georgia is a purple state. It's a state where there's a lot of political attention. going back to the politics, when you're making the case for solar to a skeptical policymaker, are you emphasizing the jobs? Are you emphasizing energy security? Are you emphasizing supply chain independence? Or is it all of the above?
All of the above for sure. And like from a manufacturing perspective, manufacturing jobs have such a tremendous community impact because they're permanent, they're quote unquote place based, um, they have multiplier effects, meaning that for every job that you create in the factory, typically you're creating like 3 to 4 in the community around it that support it. So, the incomes that those factory workers bring get deployed throughout the community. The factories themselves, require a lot of maintenance and a lot of catering and all sorts of type of work that supports businesses within that community because it's a lot of people that are there all the time. So, we've seen that in Georgia in particular, where other industries have come here. We've had a big automotive surge here over the last couple of decades, and it creates these multiplier effects where, the original investment gets made and then other investments get made to support it. You can look at, the Kia auto plant in West Point, Georgia is a good example of that, in which there's factories all over West Georgia now that are automotive suppliers that support that particular factory. So having module assembly to start is sort of drawn to, what we've been able to do in Cartersville with cell and wafer. We had a sister company of ours, Hanwha Advanced Materials, that makes EVA, which is the film that laminates cells together inside of a solar panel, built a factory next door to ours in Cartersville, and it supplies us and other solar companies around the country. So it's an emerging ecosystem that, again, resonates with folks from an economic development perspective, from a political perspective, and from an economic security perspective, given that, these are panels that are made here in America. Qcells is a Korean German company. There's an energy security story to it as well.
How has the repeal of the IRA tax credits affected the value proposition for manufacturing solar in the United States? And to ask you to put your SIA hat on, what is the solar industry advocating for in terms of those tax credits? Do you want to see them restored in the same way as before, or is there a third way that you'd like to move forward that's maybe not quite full restoration, but also not, where we are now?
To speak to the popularity of the manufacturing in particular, it's really notable that within the Inflation Reduction Act, there were, a couple of things that were passed. There's obviously the ITC extensions and the reframing them as tech neutral, but then you had adders onto them, in particular domestic content, and then that's on the demand side. On the supply side, you had the 45X manufacturing incentive, the Solar Energy Manufacturing for America Act, as it was introduced by Senator Ossoff. Obviously, the ITCs were pulled back significantly. 25D went away at the end of last year. The other credits have already sunsetted, except for if you have products safe harbored, in which you get a 4-year window to install. That's meaningful. You've seen pretty significant impacts pretty right away into the residential market in particular. But on the supply side, like, it's worth noting that the 45X manufacturing credits were not even touched, right? They were, and I think that's one of those policies that has, pretty distinct bipartisan support at this point. So, we've seen SIA and others be openly for, the supporting of those tax credits and whether it's possible to extend them later. Permitting reforms obviously really important. Tax credits on the deployment side are still where there's a lot of discussion in the industry. A lot of it's going to be politics, contingent of, what happens in the next, in these midterms, what happens in 3 years, or 2.5 years for the next presidential election. And it does a tax extenders bill move. It's, there's a lot of contingencies in terms of what is achievable. But I think in general, one, there's an understanding and an appreciation that tax credits have been an effective tool at accelerating deployment, making sure that costs are, low, right? Solar's, people regularly point to the fact that solar is the cheapest form of energy in most places around the world. But those tax credits have done a good job over time, levelizing the playing field. And again, just accelerating deployment and keeping energy prices low for customers. The other thing too, we, as a manufacturer, really supported the domestic content bonuses. I think that drives a lot of demand. You have a window to take advantage of them with all the products that have been safe harbored, but we certainly think it would be good policy long term to make sure that those domestic content bonuses are considered something that could again draw additional investments that are needed, particularly on the cell and wafer side.
Looking ahead, let's say, policymakers get the policy environment just right. Let's say, the economy continues to grow, and your factory and other factories are running at full tilt. What does a healthy American solar industry look like, say, 5 years from now? And what do we have to do to get there?
It's funny because this is where we talk about depoliticizing an industry that, in no way should be political. And, what's interesting is that, you know, obviously the last two rounds of policy that were passed that impacted our industry were done on a partisan basis through reconciliation, right? That's just the nature of reconciliation. And so the OB3 and the IRA were both partisan packages, but historically speaking, the ITC was always bipartisan. The investment tax credit had been around for decades. The solar versions of it were really codified under George Bush in 2005. They were extended during the Obama and then also the end of the first Trump administration. So, our view is there's a world where we can go back to where these incentives and these policies, or where these policies are bipartisan, right? Our industry, is very supportive of an all of the above energy strategy. Like, we think there is enough demand that there is no need to discriminate amongst energy types. Like, we think that solar and storage and should be a critical part of that. And, that's been what the key aspects of our advocacy and of SEIAs and other trade groups too, of just, really ensuring that barriers to deployment are low, and that there's as much certainty for policy as you can get. And, we're a year past the OB3. I think we're still waiting on some guidance under certain parts of it. But, once you have that certainty, folks can continue to think long term. But to your question specifically of what does a healthy industry look like, our view would be one that is able to grow consistently, has a healthy and sustainable supply chain, meaning it's diversified, it's as much domestically produced as possible, and we think that provides some really strong political benefits when you think about, again, the benefits of manufacturing on communities and on industries in general. Like, that's one of the things you've seen. Obviously the global leader in manufacturing of solar panels is China, and they also have been one of the leaders in the deployment of solar. And part of the reason of that is that they have, their manufacturing drives the deployment rather than the other way around. And there's opportunities to do that here too.
And last question, to end on a personal note, what's something about you that might surprise our audience?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think right now nothing surprises folks. I've got it's a busy industry and there's a lot going on, and I've got three small daughters, so my life is just nothing but working and parenting these days. I think a fun, interesting fact: I was in the Peace Corps for a day back when I was right out of grad school. I was doing a master's program where I was on the verge of going to Peru for a couple of years, and then met my now wife and made a relatively dramatic decision to, I was in staging for the Peace Corps and ended up coming back home and finding a new path for the next couple of years. But I worked for one day in the Peace Corps. I got a $17 check from the U.S. government for my time there, and the rest is history. I've been doing this kind of work ever since.
Seems like it was the right decision.
My wife and kids would certainly agree, so it worked out great.
Scott Moskowitz, thanks so much for joining us on the Echo Chamber.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me, Dan.